we have tonight the great pleasure and honor to host Professor Leela Gandhi from Brown University, United States. This is, as I said, the last lecture of our course, which was so full of inspiring talks and meetings with the philosophers and intellectuals from different parts of the world. And I would like to thank, first of all the people who make this possible, starting from our colleagues from the philosophical community of the Department of Humanities, my colleague Tiziana Faitini, Alessandro Palazzo, and many other, Professor Nobile, Professor Ghia, Paola Giacomoni, who is with us, all this small but active community of philosophers, and then all the other members of the departments. And one of the nicest experience of this cycle was also this form of cooperation with scholars involved in literature, history, and other subjects, other disciplines. And then I would like also to thank all the students who have participated with the presence and the questions and comments, and all the participants from the city of Trento, which who are very interested in discussing about philosophical topics. And of course, also a big thank to our administrative staff, who is so nice to support all of us in the complex organization of the cycle, which we would like very much to repeat next year. So be ready to come again to our department for a new cycle of voices from contemporary philosophy. It is a great pleasure that we have Leela Gandhi for two reasons. The first one is that she is one of the leading scholars in the field of postcolonial studies, and much more, I would say, because the first book was on postcolonial theory, Critical Introduction, 1998. But then we had other books that will be presented by my colleagues later on affective communities and philosophical, I would say, themes as ethics, democracy, participation, with this big focus on ethics of nonviolence. And the second reason is that Leela is a very good friend of Trento, of our department, of many of us. It is thanks to Paola Giacomoni that she is here. She came here for the first time, I think, 20 years ago. I was one of the first visiting scholars at the School of International Studies, with giving a course on peace. And non-violence at the time, and then also she came other times and was a very good friend of Giovanna Covi, which I would like to mention here, because Giovanna was a pillar of this conversation between philosophy and literature, especially on with this great affective attention to postcolonial dimension, to women's dimension, and so on. And she was really a great friend and great colleague for our students, for us. And I think that she's really present also in this initiative that we have organized today. The Professor Gandhi will be introduced by Paola Giacomoni first, just a few words, and then by Lisa Marchi, who I would like to thank. Lisa this morning was in dialogue, in conversation with Leela. It was a wonderful masterclass, because I have to say, this is my personal and final note, that Leela Gandhi is not only a theorist on non-violence, but she is really a model of what non-violence can be in intellectual life. How a talk can be conducted in a non-violent way, how a dialogue, how the listening to the other can be made possible by anybody. So thank you so much, Leela, for being with us. And I give the floor to Paola.
Thank you, Michele. And I thank you all for being here, also from my side, for this last conference on this beautiful series you have organized, and I hope you will you'll be able to repeat next year, because this series keeps us in touch with the new trends of philosophy in the world. Today we have the privilege and the pleasure to host Leela Gandhi here from the Brown University, who will speak about abstraction and non-violence. We will listen to Leela's original thesis on one of the greatest issues in philosophy, one of the greatest tools in philosophy. For the moment, yes, I can tell you that I have met Leela for the first time in the summer 2000 in Johannesburg, in South Africa. And from that meeting, a friendship and a collaboration were born. And also together with Joanna Covey. She came to Trento many times after that, many times. How many times? 4, maybe, or 5.
5, maybe.
Maybe. Joanna Covey was involved very deeply after that meeting, and you remember her with gratitude and emotion. And this collaboration brought Leela, yes, to Trento several times. Michele also said that Leela is a friend of our department and of the philosophy curriculum in particular. And through this collaboration and others that followed, we began to talk about postcolonial studies, postcolonial dimension, and opened up a research perspective that does not consider European culture as the only universal valid point of view. And as we will see from today's presentation, Leela considers a dialogue, it may be a contamination between the Western tradition and many aspects of the Eastern tradition, particularly Indian, to be possible and fruitful against purity, as you said this morning. Without renouncing our cultural history, it is interesting to consider it as one of the possible points of view on the world, and not the only one. Point of view that becomes an interlocutor in this way of other perspectives, particularly in this case, the one that considers non-violence as an epistemic device, an intellectual device, and not only an attitude of political action. Western philosophy can open up to other cultures by enhancing certain aspects of its own tradition and innovating its own mental categories in order to face today's challenges. This is why we welcome Leela, who brings us each time a new theoretical insight and enables us to build new and richer philosophical perspectives. For more information, I leave the floor to my colleague.
Thank you, Paola. Thank you very much. And good evening to
Good evening, everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to present our distinguished guest and dear friend, Professor Leela Gandhi. Professor Gandhi is John Hawkes Professor of the Humanities and English at Brown University. Before arriving at Brown, she taught at the University of Chicago, Delhi University, and La Trobe University in Melbourne. It would be impossible for me to cover in a few minutes the spatial and temporal vastness of Professor Gandhi's research outlook, as well as to try to illustrate the intricate entanglements between the so-called West and the rest of the world that Professor Gandhi has explored in such original, profound, and brilliant ways. To the denigration and substitution, and I'm quoting two terms that Professor Gandhi used this morning, to the denigration and substitution of traditional colonial knowledges put in place by imperial culture, Gandhi responds with an incredibly difficult work of historical excavation and vigilant custodianship of the rich traditions of spiritual syncretism, cultural cohabitation, and identitarian contamination that has been going on in the postcolonial space for millennia. In affective communities, Gandhi turns her attention to radical, movable, subterranean individuals and groups who deliberately eclipsed the blinding light of imperial Britain by forging underground alliances with colonized subjects and groups, joining their anti-colonial struggle as an act of friendship. We particularly thank Gandhi for having handed over to us the gift of fearlessness. And this is another term that, we received this morning in the morning talk. So we particularly thank Gandhi for having handed over to us the gift of fearlessness, which should animate us as we engage in the difficult task of recognizing the damages, amputations, and harmful occultations produced by European colonial cultures. Gandhi's prize of obscurity, as you will see, resonates with what Giovanna Covey, borrowing the expression from Edward Glissant, called the right to opacity. This evening, we are thrilled to listen to her lecture titled On Abstraction. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gandhi.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm humbled. And let me begin just by thanking from the bottom of my heart the Department of Philosophy, Michele Nicoletti, for this invitation, and to my very many dear and old and new friends at this university, Paola Giacomoni, Lisa Marchi, Tiziana Faitini, and many others, and Mark Vital. I have been coming to Trento for decades, and I have to say, it's one of the places where I've learned to think with others. Truly, and without being hyperbolic, it is one of the places where I have learned to think with others about some of the things that matter most to me. So I am very grateful. One such person with whom I thought for many years was my dear friend and colleague, Giovanna Covey. And I would like to acknowledge my debt to her, and if I may, dedicate this lecture to her memory with gratitude. Now, we have a small problem that I want to begin with. When I received this invitation, people work at different stages, and I was caught at the time when I'm thinking through a project, and in the early stages of thinking through a project as an academic, the project is academic. Later on, after it's done, it becomes generalizable in everyday conversation. So forgive me, this is an academic paper, but I have two things to say. I will try and gloss it as much as I can as we go along. But know that at the end, I can break it down, simplify it as you like. But in the meantime, for those of you who are just emerging, just in the field, those of you who are not academics, don't worry about the things you don't understand. Really don't, because it's a new project for me philosophically of working on atmosphere and mood, not just on content. So you may understand just a phrase or an image, and don't try to follow the argument. But something will emerge, and it gets more fluent as we move along. So a picture will emerge at the end. So just don't panic. Nor will I. And I'm just really thinking aloud. I'm thinking aloud, the privilege of being able to think aloud with well wishes. So, abstraction is often associated in a certain kind of thinking with the violence of capitalism. I'll explain this in a moment. And as a force, as something that cuts us off from life. It's also a kind of epistemic or epistemological nonviolence. That is to do a kind of a nonviolence in knowledge, in the way we know things, that thrives in the right conditions. This is my only claim. Let me begin by talking about epistemic violence. Now, there's a kind of progressive strain in what we may think of as the human sciences, which says that, there's a kind of inverse relationship between bad epistemology and human flourishing, human and non-human flourishing. And this view is prompted by the idea that there's something violent in any formalization of knowledge. When we formalize knowledge as a canon or as, say, a grammar, writing, there's a violence. And this view also gains from the idea that epistemic violence, violence in knowledge, is not only a kind of violence that knowledge does, it's also a violence done to knowledge. And by means of a system of visuality. And if this idea sounds strange, it's meant to. Okay, it's something that if there's a violence in knowledge, violence done by knowledge or to knowledge, it happens because of this kind of system of visuality. What do I mean by this? This position says that in in many systems of thought, sight, seeing, is privileged as the most important thing in our senses. Seeing is the most important thing. And there are many examples of this in academic thought. Say when it's said that a knowledge becomes knowledge when you can display it. And then, you know, the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, you know, has this idea of the sign. The sign is proof of meaning. You know, that so all of these ideas display sign. There are others. I'll come to those in a minute. So in this reading, the argument is that, well, you know, violence done to knowledge, and let's stick with that idea. And you can do violence to knowledge in any number of ways, and I'll come to that too. You can do it by silencing knowledge. You can do it by cutting it off. You can do it by not giving it air and nourishment. You know, say, you know, by not teaching certain things, by having only a limited curriculum, by starving certain forms of knowledge. That in these cases, the violence has to do, you violate knowledge when you mess with its discernibility, when you prevent it from being seen. Okay. So let's think about this together a little bit. So an epistemological, and I'll keep saying epistemological, epistemic, and I just want you to know that I mean knowledge when I say that. So an epistemological life world, because knowledge has to do with the way we live, can be cut off through strategies of something I want to think of as coercive invisibility. Okay. And I'm following here the eccentric Irish philosopher, Bishop George Berkeley, who has this idea of esse est percipi, where he says to be means to be perceived. So if someone is not perceived, if something is not perceived, it dies. Perceived, that is important. Several examples of this. So say like a really self-important knowledge, a powerful knowledge, let's think of it as a foreground, excessive knowledge object. It may block more shy forms of knowledge, background forms of knowledge, you know. It's so powerful and charismatic, it may block, and this can be a radical form of knowledge, not just a knowledge that belongs to the bad forces in society, but charismatic, over-charismatic knowledge can block shy forms of knowledge. Think of classrooms where there are some who are very voluble, and they block those who need time to think and shine in their own way. Okay, so or emerging knowledge system, you know, may lose what's precious about it when we approximate it to some established epistemology. Say for example, when we say witchcraft is a form of herbology. So it loses its eccentricity. Or, you know, a person may fail to make epistemic sense of their own experiences, and I'm thinking of women here, or say of harassment or discrimination, because the whole system of social meaning is designed to keep these experiences out of sight. So you may not know you are being harassed because there is no way of giving these ideas visibility or authority. You know, you may not be able to make sense. You know, this so often happens. I find with my younger colleagues or students, they don't know. They sometimes come and say, you know, I don't know, I felt really uncomfortable in that encounter. I don't know, you know, it's probably me, I'm just insecure. I'm not sure how to make sense of it. So this is a failure of epistemology because something is not allowed to have visibility. Okay, so that's so much for strategies of coercive invisibility, but equally disabling, equally violent is something that I want to think of as a strategy of coercive visibility. When we show something too much, okay? And I mean, these ideas, these themes overlap, okay? So for example, this can happen when, by what I want to think of sometimes as, when emerging or occluded forms of knowledge are obscured by a kind of demographic over-identification. So when you say Black thinking or Chinese philosophy or ethnomusicology. So this is a kind of over-identification that also is a kind of violence, over-visibility that is also a violence. Also, this can happen when something becomes visible as the object of prejudice. Something can become visible as the object of prejudice. And by here, I'm talking about a system, we all have experienced this, of a kind of bad relationality, where one party hides the other one's light, but exhibits only their shadows. So when you talk to friends about a loved one, only about what's wrong with them, and then that becomes real, and then you've lost it. You've lost what's precious, by making visible only the shadows of something. I want to give you a visual gloss. I'm very moved by this, by the artist Aimé Mpane, who does these amazing installations on the scramble for Africa. And he presents this scramble for Africa, something that happened with new imperialism actually in the 20th century. And he portrays this scramble for Africa as an interface of hidden radiance and hyper-visible shadows. And his installation, Congo, Shadow of the Congo, describes the annexation of the Congo as a huge shadow thrown by a transparent figure, which obscures the fallen. The shadow is bigger than the figure itself. There's another work called Olympia 2, which works with Manet's original painting, Olympia 1, where what Mpane does is he gives center stage to the Black subject. But he does it through a visual trick where her racialization, the fact that she's Black, is just the view that you can see through a slatted plywood medium of a shadow cast by the entire painting on the back wall. Now, this made of color actually casts the only light, the only illumination on this same wall in another invisible inversion. So you can only see her light at the back. Okay. Okay, so now I've been talking about epistemic violence. And what I want to get at is epistemic non-violence. But I've made a difficult bed for myself. What I've done is by digressing through these ideas of coercive visibility and coercive invisibility, I have this problem where if coercive visibility and coercive invisibility are a form of epistemic violence, then I want to suggest that epistemic non-violence is something peculiar. It is the desire, this is my proposition, to be both visible and invisible. It is the desire to be both visible and invisible. which is to say, this is, how do we find it? It's a hankering. It's a hankering for, say, disqualified forms of knowledge. Say, again, I'm using the example of women's knowledge, women's writing, for example, unmarked by the stigma of disqualification. So you want women's writing, but you don't want it to be marked by that history of disqualification. You want Black knowledge, but you don't want it to be marked by that history of disqualification. But nor do you want the prestige of qualification. You don't want to be the powerful new knowledge. You want to be visible and invisible. And this, I want to argue, this desire to be invisible and visible is a desire for abstraction. How so? Abstraction. So in our own times, which covers a lot of time, abstraction, the idea of abstraction no longer means, withdrawing or retreating from the world of things. This is thanks to many philosophical traditions, mainly the Marxist and the phenomenological, all those philosophical traditions that are interested in the world. And that emerge out of the 19th century into the 20th, of course, with a deeper past. And out of these traditions, abstraction emerges, the way we understand it now, as something that is both sensory and extrasensory. And I want to say that this is a view of abstraction, and I'm borrowing a term from the phenomenologist, the philosopher Merleau-Ponty. This is the idea that abstraction is chiasmatic, and a chiasmus is a formation, a sort of crisscross formation, in which elements that are traditionally adversarial or opposed, say mind, matter, spirit, flesh, visible and invisible, have an intersectional relation. They move from one place to another. And what they share with each other is a kind of reversibility. Mind can become matter, matter can become mind. So they have this flow between them. They are chiasmatic. It's a very useful idea. Now, the thing about this idea, let me call it this modern idea of abstraction, is that in this idea, there are no historical or geographical limits on abstraction of this time. This kind of abstraction that I'm talking upon can happen at any time, now that we know to look for it. But these thinkers of modernity, and I'm thinking primarily of Marx here, the early Marx, takes the view, thinkers in this tradition take the view that abstractions actually only become strictly chiasmatic in the way I've described at a moment of historical complexity. Okay? So they are a kind of proof of modernity. You don't find, actually, these thinkers say, you don't find abstractions of this sort in every period. But when you start to see things that are visible and invisible, that are there and not there, that are real and not real, you reached a kind of point of historical complexity. You are in modernity. You are in modernity. It's a very strange idea, but that's where philosophy does its work, by keeping company with these curious ideas. So just to give you break this down to make some sense out of it, there's this American anthropologist, Boas, who wrote a book called The Mind of Primitive Man. And he says, now, for example, these things that are visible and invisible, real and not real, practical and not practical, they only appear in a culture when it is free from biological necessity. You know, when people don't just have to have tools to stay warm or to stay cold or to eat and to take shelter, then they manufacture playful things, toys, inessential things. So they are superfluous objects, toys, homo ludens, the art of play, you know, where something is real but not real. You have to have it there. Well, it means you've arrived into modernity. It's a fascinating idea of modernity, of becoming modern, when you have things that are real and not real, abstract, chiasmatic. And Marx really takes this idea up, but this is the early Marx, whom I love, because the early Marx is full of unfinished thinking and is very interested in the occult, magic, actually. And the early Marx says something similar and even more strange than Boas. He says, look, the whole point about the development of total social capital, the capitalization of society, a good thing, ultimately, is that it delivers a kind of magic of materialization. And I don't know if he's thinking about the myth of Midas here, but he says that in this time, everything becomes real. In the time of modernity, everything becomes real. Which means, for example, that the phantoms of a primitive life, the fears and anxieties of primitive life are revealed to be, you know, weather events, for example, weather events. Everything achieves an objective form. That's all. This doesn't mean that it loses its non-objective form. This doesn't mean that it loses its occult form, but that whatever is occult becomes material. Wishes become real. So you have to be very careful. Now, here's a slightly complicated point. All of these thinkers who, and this is my point, who say that, you know, abstraction, chiasmatic abstraction of the sort I'm talking about, which is modern, such abstractions, they actually tend toward appearance, you know, and they are only knowable as a kind of incorporated visibility. Don't worry about these ideas. They'll become clear to you. But it's just, all that matters is that the argument is that these formations tend toward appearance. The argument goes a bit like this, that these chiasmatic abstractions of modernity, you know, they don't follow a kind of simple path of development where there's a transition from a well-known point before to a well-known point before. After, you know, there's no clear, it's not clear that things move from an embryonic form to a full-grown form, so that you know the adult in the embryo, you know, so it's recognizable. You know, they move from something that's known to something that's known. You know, that they're not like that, and the reason is because these abstractions, because they are made up of contrary elements. I said mind, matter, flesh, spirit. That because of their composite substance, because they are made up of so many elements, their final property, their final quality can't be predicted from their independent parts. You can't predict it. You can't foretell. You can't say for sure what invisible plus visible will look like. You can't foretell what a dream and a consumer object put together will look like in the end. There are two further qualifications. So because a chiasmatic abstraction is more than the sum of its part, you know, flesh plus spirit, mind plus matter, because it's more than simply the sum of its parts, we'll only get to know its final quality, what it really is, when it's before us. That is to say, when it appears. Okay, so you won't know it until it appears. There's another point that this appearing is a kind of quality. It's a quality of abstraction, you know, because there are some composite forms that actually don't appear. They never make the cut. They just stay in a hybrid jumble, you know, and those don't qualify. Those don't qualify as abstractions. It's only those chiasmatic abstractions that appear before us that qualify as abstraction. Okay? So a true abstraction is something manifest, it is something intelligible, it has a breakthrough quality. Okay? You can say, there it is. There it is. And if you can't say that, then it's not an abstraction. Forget about it. It's not serious. Okay. This is only one view. There are other thinkers who are interested in composite abstractions. Say, let me name some of these philosophers, you know, to the philosophers here. They are process philosophers, people who call themselves agential realists. Again, you don't need to worry about these terms. They're just tags. People who think with Spinoza, people who think about affect, who are all interested in relational systems, relational and composite systems across time and place. These thinkers are interested in vanishing points in composite systems. So they are interested in how composite forms of abstraction, how the different parts lose their identity when they come together. They disappear. They are interested in intra-constitution, in absorption, in the idea of entanglement of the relevant relata, to take a few examples. So simply to repeat what I just said, such abstractions under this remit tend toward disappearance. And they are knowable as a kind of incorporated invisibility. So here's my schema. Okay, I'm saying that this idea of incorporated visibility and incorporated invisibility are the two forms of modern abstraction, of chiasmatic abstraction. And I'll be doing in what follows three things with this idea in no particular order. First, I just want to share some genealogies, some examples of incorporated visibility and incorporated invisibility. And I want to look in every example, every case, for cases when abstraction serves epistemic nonviolence in knowledge. That's what I'm looking for in all of these examples. And, you know, though I will be talking about abstract images and abstract objects, my main focus today is on abstraction as a form of knowledge. Now, second, these genealogies that I want to think through with you are set against the general background of the Cold War. Okay? Because in this period, there was a kind of weaponization of knowledge. This was say the knowledge of nuclear scientists was literally weaponized, but also this idea of intelligence, of espionage, and the gathering of intelligence through spying became an idea or a trope. Finally, I want to really keep company with conditions where disappearance is the property of a forgotten form of modern abstraction. Okay. Just to summarize I'm saying that abstraction can serve violence and non-violence, especially violence in knowledge and non-violence in knowledge. And when abstraction serves violence, it takes the form of coercive visibility or coercive invisibility. Okay? And I'm saying that, well, when it serves non-violence, it takes the form of visibility and invisibility, both. So I'm giving you a tautology here. It's the same thing, but with some difference. There's a very close relation between violent forms of abstraction and non-violent forms of abstraction. But in the main, as I think through non-violent abstraction, I want to compare ideas of abstraction that tend more towards appearance and ideas of abstraction that tend more toward disappearance. Both are invested in non-violence, but I want to argue that those that tend toward disappearance deserve our attention. They deserve our attention. Okay. Nature loves to hide. So these days, there's a lot of interest in the academy. Do you want to have something for you? Something very good. Okay. So there's a lot of interest these days in the work of the philosopher Karl Jaspers. Some of you may know this name well. And his concept of the idea of something called an axial age. Axial age. And now this term characterizes a period between about 800 and 200 BCE, in which there was allegedly an advance of a universal tendency toward abstract thinking in many parts of the ancient world, including Palestine, China, India, Persia, and Greece. Of course, this chronology disqualifies Islamic thought, nor do Africa and the Americas make the list. But still, many people believe that, well, you know, for all its faults, Jaspers' formulation is very progressive. It may even be postcolonial. It may be a postcolonial European perspective on multiple modernities. Multiple modernities. What's less often known is that Jaspers also says that axial type philosophy is an agent of world peace. And he argued in his moment that it was adequate even to the threat of extinction. And this is a claim he made in a book that's little read today. It's a wonderful book, 1956, called The Atom Bomb and the Future of Mankind. And it was strongly endorsed by Hannah Arendt, who was a disciple and a friend of Jaspers, and she gave a laudation for the occasion when Jaspers was awarded the German Book Trade's Peace Prize, you know, just a few years after he'd written this book, for this book, really, and others. How? What does he mean? What is this? What is he talking about? How does axial age, what is the axial age, and how does its exposition become equal to the bomb and to violence? Wow. Now, some people might say, look, this is an ecumenical epistemology. Any ecumenical epistemology, look at our own narrow times, which is willing to think of Socrates, Confucius, Buddha, Jesus, and Zarathustra, but never mind the forgotten indigenous populations and the great prophets of Islam. never mind those, but anyone who is willing to at least think of all of these in the same breath counters the parochialism of Cold War thought, because the argument is that the Cold War is the end of ecumenism. And actually, we do need to think more about how we are heir to the Cold War. Actually, we forget because it was cold and, it passed notice, but we are really heir to the parochialism of that war. And so he says, so how, what else besides this ecumenism? How else is it equal to the violence of the Cold War? So what Jasper says is, well, this axial philosophy, by axial, those people he thinks of as axial philosophers, what they counter is a sort of instrumentalism and technological know-how culture of the nuclear age. How do I make this bomb? How do I acquire this knowledge? Edward Said talks about this instrumentalization of knowledge that happens with the Cold War. How do I achieve this end? How do I govern this territory? How do I mine this earth? So he says that the people he thinks of as axial philosophers are actually interested in inwardness, habits of inwardness. But, as a kind of new mundane tradition that seeks its habitation on earth, something that is inward, but that it belongs to the world. It seeks its habitation on earth. It's like as though abstract thinking is it has a concreteness. And axial age is the age of abstraction, much as there was once an age of bronze or stone or iron. So there was this age of abstraction. It was something we can touch almost. But mostly, to go back to where I began, it is something we can see. This axial abstractions that Jaspers celebrates are always on view. They are always on view. Now, the reason for some of this, if you go through some of Jaspers' examples, have to do with social history. The people he thinks of as axial age philosophers, Confucius is one. They have names and biographies. They emerge from the shadowy past. Their teaching is codified, it's communicable, it becomes hegemonic in certain places. These thinkers have the backing of institutions and patrons. And though many of them start out as ascetics and renunciates and hermits, the moment they discover the truth, the moment they discover the reality of who they are, they want to share it. And this is an Arendtian point. They want to share this knowledge. They want to make it public. So they come out, and these are stories of, Jaspers did not think with the Prophet Muhammad, but that example of coming out once you have a revelation, of sharing. It's also the idea of the gospel, the desire to share. The Buddha, after all that fasting, realizes, no, there's a middle way. I have to share it. And he immediately founds a sangha, a community to share, to make that knowledge public. Now, such a commitment to spaces of appearance, and I'm borrowing a term from Hannah Arendt for the public realm, is matched by a commitment to a philosophy of appearance. This means, and this is an idea that Hannah Arendt, the great philosopher, thinks with a lot, that appearance and its corollaries, say ideas such as light, disclosure, seeing, showing, clearing, these are the main topics of axial philosophy. Go to any axial philosopher and you'll find they're talking about metaphors of visibility. They're talking about seeing. So let's think with this idea for a moment. An important writer on the axial age tells us that, for example, the love of light in Zarathustra's teaching, whom the West knows through Nietzsche, is the same thing. Zarathustra loves light. He's always following the light. It's the same thing as theory or theoria in the old Greek sense of the word, meaning the business of being a spectator. And on the premise that truth is better seen than heard. But the philosopher who is really powerful on this idea of appearance as the main theme of any philosophy that matters actually is Martin Heidegger, difficult thinker. And he develops this idea from work he was doing, a series of lectures on some works of Plato, the allegory of the cave, but also a work called Theaetetus, where the idea of episteme is discussed furiously. Heidegger's work on Plato became really important for axial age philosophers. And what Heidegger says is that there's the Greek word aletheia, which is usually translated as truth, but which he translates as unhiddenness. Unhiddenness gives us a grasp of sight-oriented thought. It clarifies how thinking, not just thinking, but thinking that matters is not just something that is oriented towards the visible, but it's something that is oriented against the hidden. So it's something that you need to, and I'm using words from Heidegger, that needs to be torn and robbed and dragged from the hidden. He says, Heidegger says, man must advisedly use a kind of violence to be able to ask about himself. So you have to tear the truth from the hidden, and there is a kind of violence. It's no getting away. So in this sequence of thought, what Heidegger does is he identifies the hidden. What is hidden? As something pre-philosophical, something that does not belong to philosophy, as something that is animal. He says on many occasions, nature loves to hide. Nature loves to hide. And these judgments, when you start looking for it, they became really powerful in Heidegger's critical milieu under his influence. There was now a thinker who we don't read probably for very good reason, a man called Roger Caillois at the College of Sociology in France. Then, of course, Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno of the Frankfurt School, and Jacques Lacan as well. All these thinkers developed hypotheses in conversation with each other that basically demoted concealment and hiding as a viable form of knowledge. They declared the hidden and all its correlatives, camouflage, mimicry, masking, all these ideas as a kind of negative cognition, completely at odds with this compact between appearance and being. Esse est percipi. To be means to be perceived. To be means to be seen. And if you are not seen, you do not exist. A knowledge that is not seen does not exist. Knowledge must tend towards appearance. Okay. Let's start talking about disappearance. From ritual to philosophy. So, when you think about I actually think Jesper's contribution is great. It's great. I'm just thinking with it critically. When you think about this hypothesis that I've just pointed out to you, nature loves to hide. We must dare knowledge from nature. When you look at this knowledge from the perspective of the non-West, it's a little bit complicated because what Jaspers does is to, while saying that there were some thinkers in the non-West who achieved this kind of thinking, his argument is that they did so by breaking with their own forms of knowledge. Okay, so his interest is, again, we were talking about rupture this morning, is with internal forms of rupture, in the non-West. Not the colonizer coming with the sword and saying this is primitive knowledge, but a sort of movement within the tradition to break from itself, to be self-divided on its own, to get rid of paganism, superstition, myth, idolatry itself. And these older forms of knowledge are epistemologies of the hidden, epistemologies of hiding. So of these local historical, axial age is very, Jaspers is very interested, therefore, in identifying precise local historical agents who perform this rupture on their own forms of knowledge. And thinker I am very interested in, who crops up, is not one of the great heroes of axial age, crops up, is a kind of wild renunciate in the Indic tradition. I say Indic, by the way, because I refuse the division of that part of the world into Hindus and Muslims, and Indic belongs to all of us. We are all from the Indus Valley. So I say Indic for that reason and not India, because these knowledges existed before partition, and so they belong to everyone. Okay, so an Indic thinker I'm very interested in is someone who Jaspers invokes very early in his volumes on great philosopher, and this is a man called Yajnavalkya of Mithila. And this man, Yajnavalkya, is really celebrated by Jaspers and others for basically getting rid of the ritualism of Indic worlds. And as someone who takes his inspiration directly from the sun, and who is really interested in the philosophy of sight. Now, we don't know whether Yajnavalkya was a real figure or not, as in many Indic figures. We don't know about his historicity, but he's certainly very alive in the texts. He has a very sharp characterization, and he's very colorful. But we know him in scholarship through two loci classici, two bodies of work, in which he becomes available as a quintessential axial age philosopher. The first has to do with his association with a corpus of works called the Dharma Shastras that dealt with law and with the duties of rulers. And actually, colonial rulers in India, as elsewhere, often looked to indigenous forms of law to model their own mode of governmentality, thereby creating really oppressive systems. The worst of the local past and the worst of the colonial present. So these were very hidebound forms of law, but they were very interested in reviving these ideas, and they became very interested in Yajnavalkya, who was associated with the codification of evidence, and witnessing and testimony for purposes of incrimination in the ancient Indic past. And now we know that these elements, evidence, witnessing, testimony, are key elements, and we know this from Michel Foucault, among others, are really important in the modernization project of making punishment more public. You know that a culture becomes civilized when punishment is public, not transparent. That is to say, Foucault tells us, when it's a set of signs that is generalized through the social body, and it supersedes, elementary rituals of pain that are masochistic and sadistic, and are inflicted in a case-by-case basis on the body of this or that perpetrator. So you just don't know what punishment is coming to you in the primitive pre-legal past, but you just don't know. It's not transparent. You don't know what will be done to you. You don't know what will be done to you. Will your nails be pulled out? Will you be excommunicated? You don't know. But what happens with the codification of witnessing evidence and testimony is that it's now public. It's clear to everybody. So Yajnavalkya, everyone loves. Jaspers loves Yajnavalkya, like the colonial administrators, for making law visible. Okay. But Yajnavalkya is also associated with a body of texts called the Upanishads, which literally means, beautifully, to sit down beside. To sit down beside. It's a repository of Sanskrit language dialogues and teachings that have developed the status of scripture in formal Hinduism. And from the beginnings of their transmission, these works were celebrated by Indologists as the work of famous renunciates, seers who put an end to the culture of sacrifice. And they are taken as a high point in the sublimation of ritual behaviors when the actual killing of sacrificial victims, sometimes human, but mainly horses, was supposedly swapped for the practice of sacrificing the self. So instead of actually sacrificing an animal, you sacrificed yourself. By getting rid of your egotism and your cravings and attachments. And through incorporeal means, you kill your attachments, you kill your desires by controlling your breath, rather than by hacking off parts of your body or someone else's body. So in this account, there's a great emphasis on how the world of sacrifice was brutal and violent. There was blood, there was altars, there was dismemberment. It was a bloody business. But with the Upanishads, and I'm really following Jasper's argument here, what happens is that there's a passage from this outer material life to inner life, from ritual to realization. But also, and here's another complicated point, in this passage, there is this passage from sacrifice to renunciation. Sacrifice to renunciation. Any account, if you go to anthropology of the 20th century, you'll find again and again this idea. There's a movement from sacrifice to renunciation, from sacrificing others to sacrificing yourself, as the hallmark of modernity. This passage is also a passage from secrecy to visibility. It's a hard point. It's counterintuitive, because what I'm really mapping here is a passage from something like outwardness, secrecy, to something like inwardness, visibility. And this view builds on the assumption that actually subterfuge, hiding, secrecy, hocus pocus, is the salient style of sacrificial cultures. You have initiated specialists, you have clandestine habits, you have garbled speech, you have rituals that only some people know and not other people know. It's all done very, only you have to be initiated. You have to be initiated in order to be a good ritualist. Some people argue that, sacrifice is in fact is a performance of secrecy. It's a performance of secrecy in which actually bringing a secret about is a desired epistemological goal. You produce a secret, you produce something that is mysterious, that is the goal of the culture of sacrifice. And that this view is endorsed by a prayer, a mantra. It's now the word mantra is available to everyone. Everyone knows what that means, you know. It's a mantra that actually belongs to these contexts. And I'll quote the Sanskrit. In Sanskrit, it goes, Paroksha priya iva hideva. Paroksha priya iva hideva. And it means the gods love the hidden. The gods love the hidden. Now, for philosophers of the unhidden, such as the thinker, the intellectual Roger Kewa, who I mentioned earlier, this kind of outlook on the world, where there's something sacred about the hidden, is a very backward thing. It's a really backward thing. It's what he calls a fiat of depersonalization, a failure of distinction, a failure of élan vital, in which life itself takes a step backwards. Because Kilwa says, almost speaking in the voice of Heidegger and Lacan and others, a people can only enter history and civilization when they are unmasked, when they are on view. Those who don't do it don't enter history. Don't enter history. Now, in this thinking, secretive knowledges, knowledges of secrecy, knowledges for secrecy, are very closely associated with violence in axial scholarship, very closely associated with violence. I've given you the example of rituals of pain in primitive punishment, rituals of killing and sacrifice cultures. But Arendt says, take the example of the science of the bomb. Because here is a knowledge that's hidden from public view. This is the problem of the violence of the Cold War, for someone like Arendt, for someone like Jaspers, because it is a regime of invisible government. It's a speech that doesn't disclose. It's full of truths and half-truths. Does that remind you of our time and our politicians? Even so, yes, there is something true in this, but even so, I'm walking a very fine line here, but it's important to do that. Heidegger's invitation, that's what I'm keeping company with here. Heidegger's invitation to counter the bad violence of invisible knowledges with the good violence of visible knowledges is not nonviolent. It's not nonviolent. It actually has much more in common with discourses on just war, you know, on policing and on deterrence. It's a kind of epistemic pacification, but it's not really nonviolent. Okay? The gods love the hidden. Okay, now the kind of story. Early in the 1930s, there was a scholar of Indic scholar of Indic stuff. He was called A.B. Dhruva. No one knows about him now. But he coined this wonderful idea. When I found it, I was in ecstasy. It's the idea of, he calls it intellectual ahimsa. Ahimsa means non-violence, non-harmfulness. Ahimsa, himsa is harmfulness, ahimsa, non-harmfulness. He coined this idea of intellectual ahimsa, intellectual non-violence. Now, Dhruva was an associate of M.K. Gandhi and a prominent educator. And he was really interested in one thing. He believed that all life is sacred, and because all life is sacred, all knowledge is sacred. Because different forms of life have different forms of knowledge. And to make this point, he tried to revive a form of abstract thinking known as Kevala Jnana. Now, this phrase, jnana means knowledge. The word kevala is often translated to mean knowledge of aloneness or being cut off from the world. But it also means very rare or rarefied kind of knowledge. And it's associated with several ascetic heterodox epistemologies, Jainism. Some of you may have heard of Jainism. We hear more of Buddhism. But Jainism, Buddhism, yoga philosophy, which is again developed world status now. All of these systems are very interested in nonviolence. Not all Indic systems are interested in nonviolence. Let me make that clear. Some are. Those that are tend to be heterodox. It's really there. But these are some philosophies that are very closely interested in nonviolence. Now, Dhruva's idea of intellectual ahimsa, I'm going to say ahimsa now, just to stay with the reverberation of that word. It wasn't exactly a success. People forgot about it, but it was taken up. This idea of intellectual ahimsa was taken up by other philosophers, who, especially a philosopher called Bimal Motilal. And he said that, well, this intellectual nonviolence, it's an ideal of pluralism, really. And he used words like manyness, maybiness, emptiness, to clarify what this form of intellectual ahimsa meant. And his argument was, and he takes us back to the ancient sources, is that kevala jnana, it's a form of omniscience, of knowing everything, that is only available to an advanced knower, kevalan. How so? What does it mean? A kevalan is someone who sees everything at once. He, advisedly, she sees everything at once. And more so, she sees that everything is true. Now, this is very different from the perception that everything is real. It's a step up. Everything is true. She sees everything at once and sees everything as true. Actually, philosophical skepticism is a bit like that, to see everything at once. And this is a kind of epistemological pluralism that grasps the validity of all perspectives, And it includes the view that any proposition must incorporate rival possibilities and contradictory predicates in order to be valid. So this means, even for me to say nonviolence is important, I have to say nonviolence is not important. I have to say nonviolence is important and not important. So unless I say that, I do not possess any knowledge worth its salt. This kevalan, this kind of knowledge where you see everything at the same time. When you practice this, all propositions, all perspectives lose their rigidity. They lose their fixation. To draw on a word that Lisa has trained me to think with today, helped me think with today. And they also lose any claim to a core meaning. So you can say that antagonisms, disappear. They disapparate under the gaze of the kevalan, who is gifted with a seeing that hides. It's a seeing that hides. So when you are in the company of someone who is a wise kevalan, you don't worry about your position. Your differences disappear. Because the knowledge of the kevalan hides your attachment to your own position. It disappears. It no longer becomes important. And manuals on how to become a kevalan tell us that the Kevalin has proof of achieving perfected knowledge when they experience their own mind as a cloak of invisibility, in which everything achieves dissolution, in which there's a phrase from an ancient text where the Kevalin knows, I have knowledge, when she experiences the disappearance of the universe in herself. And in the process, the function of the knower disappears as well. So iconic images that often portray the Kevalin as a kind of presence in absence, and made up of negative open space. And the visual effect is achieved through metal cutouts of the human form that leave an empty silhouette in place. And we can see this in this meditation sculpture from the early 20th century. Now, for the philosophers of intellectual ahimsa, with whom I began, Kevala Jnana is a kind of intellectual tolerance. It's a kind of, it's just being tolerant of people with different opinions. And Gandhi was very fond of this form of knowledge because he wanted people to be tolerant of each other's faults. He thought that was very important to knowledge. But such a perspective doesn't quite grasp the full heft of what is involved in this epistemology. And what is at the heart of this epistemology is something really deep. And it's the view that hiding the world, hiding its knowledges, makes these sacred in the sense of inviolable to injury and injuriousness. You can only rescue knowledges from violence if you hide them a little bit. And this idea, actually, we learn from actual practices of concealment in the street by activists, in practices of refuge, of sanctuary, of giving asylum, of providing camouflage, in strategic, direct action, nonviolent practice. And I'm nearly at the end, and I want to take you to these examples now. Okay. Total camouflage for total war. And this I'm going to read out, having paraphrased what I'm saying so far. Okay. So the Cold War conditions that moved Jaspers, as I've been saying, to set philosophy against the bomb, they fostered a resurgence in nuclear pacifism all over the world. The movement against the development, possession, and use of atomic weapons was really ridiculed as a communist distortion of Gandhian methods. But Gandhi was nowhere on the scene. He'd been assassinated in 1948. Yet his influence, or his name, pervades Cold War pacifism on both sides of the Iron Curtain as a prompt to establish a global system of nuclear restraint. Now, the Fellowship of Reconciliation in the US published a pamphlet called Gandhi and the H-Bomb in 1950 with a new agenda for disarmament. The Italian Gandhian, whom I admire so much, Aldo Capatini, inaugurated an international coordinating center for nonviolence in Perugia to counter the Cold War division of the world. The nuclear scientist and historian Didi Kosambi showcased the Gandhian strategies against nuclear proliferation at the Asia-Pacific Peace Conference held in, of all places, in Beijing in 1952. And in the same year, a pacifist group of young radicals took the name Operation Gandhi. And it launched the country's first direct action protests against atomic weapons manufacture. And their efforts paved the way towards the campaign for nuclear disarmament, CND. Now, there was a general consensus across the spectrum, I've just noted, to foil the the policy of nuclear deterrence, along with associated proposals for selective defenders that had begun to emerge in the 1950s, and it reached a high point with Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. And this was the kind of fantasy of a shield that could protect us from nuclear missiles, just as a family protects, a roof protects a family from rain. There was a man called Alex Comfort, who's better known as the author of a book called The Joys of Sex, but who was also an active member of Operation Gandhi. And he developed a propaganda proposal to convey the impossibility of this idea. And he has many, in the Operation Gandhi archives, where I spent some time, there are many images from him of an umbrella man to be plastered across London with the caption, umbrellas don't stop the bomb. Now, I don't believe this ever saw light of day, Alex Comfort's umbrella man. Yet, let's call it an apparatus or knowledge structure of camouflage took hold among pacifists. And it gained a lot of inspiration from Salvador Dali's decree that total camouflage is an urgent pacifist aim. And he wrote a 1942 manifesto called Total Camouflage for Total War. And later he wrote a similar follow-up manifesto in 1951 called The Mystical Manifesto for the Atomic Age. Now, Dali argues that camouflage techniques to conceal aggressors, say guns, cruisers, tanks, we still see it. We have images of war on our screens all the time. These weapons of mass destruction are camouflaged. And Dali said that this mode of concealment of aggressors had borrowed from the principles of Cubism. And actually, Pablo Picasso acknowledges this. He's walking in the street with Gertrude Stein once, and he sees a tank with camouflage on it, and he says, I invented this. So Dali says, no, there's a new form of camouflage, and this is surrealistic and Dali-esque in inspiration, and it is going to be interested in total invisibility for all in circumstances of an emerging war of extinction. The ability to provide total camouflage, he adds, is actually only given to an artist who's slightly paranoid. And I think he was being treated by Lacan at the time. And for Dali, this means someone who sees everything and therefore shows everything, a caveman, such as invisible matter, corpuscles, atoms, but also the spirituality of all substance. In plain terms, camouflage is the art of putting together a crowd of coeval and coterminous images. And so Dali writes, an image can be rendered invisible without transformation simply by surrounding it with other images, which make the spectator assume he is looking at something else. So if you are all invisible if I see you together. Such an inspiration also gains from the Cold War pacifist project of One World or None, which took its inspiration from a publication of 1946 with that title, issued by several of the scientists who had developed nuclear technology and had profound concerns about the nuclear age they had unleashed. And the project claimed that the only protection against the sheer scale of nuclear fission is the awareness of the holistic threat of nuclear war. And that to understand this, you need an ethical grasp of collective planetary victimhood. And it also means a figural grasp of the iconography of the entire earth as a means to conceal combatants, borders, and isolated targets. You know, we've learned this from the environmental movement of our time, which has revived this idea of one world or none, of seeing everything together. The principle is elementary. It reenacts a kind of seeing that hides. And it asserts that everyone will be safe, uninjurable, once we know that no one is safe. There's a visual inference. If everyone can be made concurrently visible, everyone can be made concurrently invisible as well. In 1958, the Operation Gandhi movement commissioned a young designer called Gerald Holtom to develop a visual icon for this ideology of disarmament, camouflage. As he set to work, Holtom wanted to make a design that would give symbolic cover, as it were interpictorially, to the intensely vulnerable figure of the civilian facing a firing squad in Francesco Goa's painting, The Executions. Holtom's final design presents an abstract image of the entire globe in the spirit of one world or none. Over the image, a likely crosshair is substituted by the composited semaphore letters N and D for nuclear disarmament. And we know this as the icon, we know this icon as the peace sign. Holtom's peace sign was first displayed in public at an anti-nuclear march from London to the atomic weapons establishment in Aldermaston, where nuclear weapons are manufactured to this day. There were 500 placards on sticks. Badges of the symbol were also widely distributed. These were cast in ceramic by a potter from Norfolk called Eric Austin, and they were issued with a circular from the manufacturer. It specifies that the extreme heat withstood by the badges in the firing process makes them amongst the few objects likely to survive nuclear disaster. Nearly there. Coda, totally unintelligible. So in a note on how abstraction is entangled with the history of extinction, the Guyanese painter, Aubrey Williams, gives us an example of the indigenous people, the Maya. He tells us, he may be making this up, but it's as important. He says that when the Maya felt their era would pass, they got involved in the process of their own disappearance. By burying artifacts in wells called cenote, which Aubrey Williams says means something like the total or everything of us. The aim was less to preserve such artifacts, Williams hints, than to bring dignity to their vanishing. He takes this as a cue to best practice in abstract art. It's impossible, he says, it's impossible to honor through realist modes of recovery and representation the devastation of the Caribbean Middle Passage, the enslavement of populations from whole parts of the world. It's impossible to honor through realist modes of recovery and representation the decimation of indigenous pasts, the ecological crises triggered by industrial capitalism. He is always writing about the death of birds, Williams, the death of birds. His riposte is a synesthetic medium in which a kind of liberated sensorium, it fends off the reflex of visibility. He says he wants to make paintings where the ear picks up the color of the past, where skin speaks, and so on. But to be totally unintelligible as I end, how might curbs on visibility resonate with ascetic restraints of the senses so common to cultures of pacifism and nonviolence? See no evil, say no evil, hear no evil. Does austerity of vision corroborate elective silence, stillness, not hearing, and perhaps not thinking, whenever the eye is the guide to mind? So I ask you, what is called not thinking? Thank you.
Thank you, Leela, for your very rich presentation. It is also intimidating for everyone. It is not easy. It was not easy to follow you between visibility and non-visibility. But we have many stimuli for the discussion. Who wants to
I think Federico has kindly accepted me as a response.
I was given this really hard task of starting the conversation and as acting as respondent to your amazing talk. And well, I'm not sure I can actually do that way. Like it's well, first of all, thank you. Like it was really, really amazing. And more than responding to what you said, I think that the only thing that makes sense to do is kind of testifying to the experience of listening to your talk, which I'm wondering if it corresponds to what you have experienced, which was for me characterized by what Michele suggested at the beginning, like the very powerful identification of the subject or object of your interest and the method that you're adopting. So thinking about on nonviolence by means of a nonviolent approach, a nonviolent thinking, which this experience for me was characterized by the feeling that like as you were presenting your argument, it was kind of constantly shifting, like, and I mean, rather than distinguishing thing, I really had the feeling that the goal was that of trying to eschew in all possible ways and in like a strictly methodological way all stark distinctions, and rather focusing on how whatever you encounter, rather than identifying it as good or bad, you try and turn it upside down or rather inside out and see how there can be something ambiguous, interesting, multiple, generative in all objects, including violence.
Yes.
Including violence. So like these non-violent approach to thinking, I have the feeling that has as its main core the idea that whatever is presented as violent, which is unfortunately most of what surrounds us all the time, because that's probably also what in one way of what life is, right? Still, like in whatever appears as violent can be found, can be approached in nonviolent terms, which is, if I understand it right, what you're doing with abstraction, right? So abstraction presented as something that, as it is usually understood, is somehow violent in the sense that it is connected with form, distinction, detachment from reality, detachment from nature, detachment from the material world, is actually something that, when understood properly, can encapsulate something generative, open, and you know, even non-violent. Well, this is like my just yeah, what was my experience. I don't know if it corresponds to your intention. Okay, I have a series of questions I would like to ask, but I'll try to pick one out of the many. Let me think which one I can go for. And it, but well, the one that is, well, it's just like it corresponds more closely to my interests. So, which is the concept of modernity. Something that we discussed before, which you, if I get it right, by combining many different definitions or approaches to modernity, you see as you were saying before, like as a trans-historical concept that is performed in different ways at different times, in different thoughts, in different by different thinkers, so that the axial age, if I get it right, appears as a metaphor of modernity, or as a form of modernity, which can, as everything else, be at the same time positive and negative. So I'm and which makes your thinking, but again, I don't know if it makes much sense to turn to these labels, but like very far from a postmodernist, postmodernism. Am I right? So it is more it's not an idea of like modernity is over. Let's find something else. Let's find it somewhere else where to look for, but rather let's try and integrate and see how the modernist project, if we want to still call it that way, can have something to say, can have something to be still worked on. So is it your
yes
sorry.
Please go on.
No,
I'm talking now. I'm more interested.
Well, but I'm starting to feel that I'm talking too much.
No, that's contrary.
So
Fascinating.
and if whatever it is that you see as still productive and useful in the modernist and modern project seems to be very much connected to alternative or a transformation or a shift in the epistemological system that we are constantly immersed in, and of how this is modeled upon a certain metaphors of perception of the word, right? So the key with visibility, invisibility, which is charismatic, as you said. And I really liked what Lisa, the quote you said of, was it I don't remember who you were quoting, but like the right of opacity. So but it was somebody, was it quoted by Giovanna, right? Okay. So is precisely this trying of thinking beyond the alternative visible, invisible. And I'm wondering, can we find this same thing related to other senses? Like, can you think it in terms of haptic connection with the word, in which, you know, the embrace and the violent physical contact with the other can both be combined somehow in a creative and generative way?
That's a really beautiful point. I just want to say yes. I want to keep hearing you. I think that's a really beautiful point, and that's really what I'm hoping for. Is to give a small example of something that is itself and not itself, that is touching and not touching.
Okay.
And that is very important, to be both those things at the same time. You know, I really take my inspiration from ancient systems of skepticism. Yeah.
Okay.
Where it's very important, precisely.
Thanks.
Please.
No. Before I'm going with my blathering talk, maybe it's the right time to open the floor to any other questions or comment you might have on Leela's talk.
So please don't feel intimidated. You know, one only thinks together.
Maybe the other.
It might be very long, so I just ask something that might sound stupid, but
No. I don't allow women to ever say that.
okay.
So when men say it, I praise them. Yes.
Have you ever read any Christian medieval mystics?
Well, yes, some. I have. I'm very interested in Hildegard, and I've been reading a wonderful book on Saint Teresa of Avila. Why do you ask?
Well, I thought of them, like I have to read them for my research, but I thought of them often during your speech. First, because of the metaphor of light, like of light as a metaphor of knowledge. And we know that I think these might come from a theological understanding of knowledge. And then I feel often your talk ended in oxymoron, no?
Yes.
Like you were trying to keep both sides and
Yes.
not to negate each.
Wonderful.
Or to
Wonderful.
yeah. So I don't know. You might probably read, for instance, and that's why I was asking you about medieval mystics. This Angela da Foligno.
Aha.
And she has this quite interesting concept of to be in tenebra and non in tenebra.
Ah, beautiful.
Yeah.
Angela
da Foligno. But this is something that recurs in like the tradition of mystical thought. And it dates back more or less to Dionigi Areopagita. And I don't know, maybe this comes to you from deconstruction, so from Derrida, who was also reading a lot of, who studied negative theology a lot. So I don't know, I saw this connection, that's why I asked you about the medieval mystics. And now that you say that you read skepticism, this makes sense to me. But
that's beautiful. That's thank you. Thank you. I think indeed the inspiration, the deep inspiration, is mystical traditions of the world.
Yeah, the point is like, how do you keep this when we don't have the reference to God anymore? Like, or at least, you know what I mean? Like
say
how,
more. Say more.
Not sure I can say more, but I mean, how do you keep this together? Like this, not negating the negation, neither affirming the affirmation, when you don't have the primary concept holding this, because in Christian mysticism this is all held together.
Of course, yes.
So
yes, I see that. I see that. You know, but see, It's a very important point. But much of what I'm drawing on is, from the tradition of non-monotheism also, and also sometimes forms of atheistic mysticism, of which Buddhism is an example. It's a difficult idea because, of course, the medieval mystics you mentioned, and their corollaries in the Indic tradition, the Sufi saints and the Bhakti saints, whose experience of tenebrae and non-tenebrae came from the love of God, that love. We were speaking a little bit about this earlier, but it's very appealing. The traditions that I'm talking about, skepticism, there's not enough love there. There's not enough love there because God is not there as an object for whom one is in tenebrae and not in tenebrae. It's really just to discover the truth, the truth. So it belongs to knowledge rather than to love. And in the tradition from which I come from many, I also come from the European tradition, but one of the traditions from which I come, you can take two paths to the light. One is the path of knowledge, and the other is the path of love. But they are equal. So I think that the conclusions of the medieval mystics are available in these earlier ancient traditions without God and perhaps without love. But they have overlaps in the area of knowledge, which is why I could only justly represent the work I was doing here as something that belongs to knowledge rather than to God or to love. Though there are certainly continuities. You are not satisfied.
I have to think.
You have to think, so I have to think too. That's very, very, very true.
Other questions? Or comments?
Doubts are good. Doubts are good. Suggestions are better. Yes. Can you all tell me your name? Tell me your name. Bianca.
I'm Romesa.
Romesa.
Sorry. So my question might seem also naive, so I'm humbled by your presentation.
No, not allowed.
I'm humbled by your presentation. Thank you so much. It was inspiring to listen to you talk. I actually come from a literature background, so it was really inspiring to go back to Saussure and all those Foucault, and there is always this link between politics and literature. My first question, because you've talked about mysticism, I was just wondering, out of curiosity, if you have ever read The Conference of the Birds?
Yes.
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 Because I was also thinking about it when you talked about the knowledge and and my second question, when you were talking about knowledge structure, this might not be very much related, but might be also related. What do you think about the movement of decolonization of knowledge that is nowadays taking place in universities? I've seen that in the universities throughout the UK. So
indeed,
I'd like to hear from you, is it really decolonization of knowledge and bringing this knowledge to visibility to be visible? Or, so
it's a big question. I'll kind of hazard an answer, and then I'd love to hear from you, because I must confess, I mean, I've kind of, I've dined out on postcolonialism, but now that it's come to decolonization, I feel a little bit nervous. I feel a little nervous. I was talking about this morning, that I don't know what you get after decolonization. I don't know. I worry about what will happen. What is there? What will you find? Because I mean, the pre-colonial isn't a very nice place. So I don't know. do I think in places like the UK, especially where, you know, I studied as well, and there was no sense. There was just this sense of the calm movement through history of truth without any reference to the imperial apparatus and encounters of that knowledge. That has to change. You have to let the world in. You know, you have to say it's intolerable that non-Western knowledges, Persian, Arabic, Sanskrit, just are there as captures of Oriental philology. That has to go, or the view that other forms of knowledge are violent, you know. That has to go. But then I don't know about decolonization, because, you know, I find in, you know, Hindu extremism, all kinds of extremisms, also take their inspiration from the decolonization of knowledge. So I don't know. Now you tell me, what do you think? Because you're going through it now.
I mean, at the beginning, maybe the idea was like just bring those who also contributed to the making of knowledge, because knowledge is universal. But I think over time it has become consumed and also just for marketing, that this university has decolonization movement, also it's selling itself. So over time it has become like a marketing strategy. That's my
Yeah. You see, I just think there should be something about just the honest thing of, you know, this is really messy, and we just have to stay, like Donna Haraway says, you know, stay in the trouble, but call out the trouble, you know, and that's harder to market. It's harder to grasp, but it's kind of more real. So I don't want a knowledge in which I can't read Foucault, you know, or I only have to read some texts that are decreed to be purely Indic by some politician, you know. I don't want that. So yeah, it's a really important question, really, really important question. And thank you for bringing up the Can I call on you for one more second? Because everyone here might not know about the Conference of the Words. And would you share what it is for those who don't?
It's a book by Al-Attar. Its name is actually, the full name is Farid Abduddin Al-Attar. I read this book in the lockdown, or I started reading it because a friend of mine was also doing PhD in comparative literature in Queen Mary's University of London, suggested this book to me. And it's, do I explain the idea? It's like a group of birds who go on a journey, and then that journey of truth becomes God, or like a way of God. This is like a very simplification of the idea.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay. And it's such an important trope in sort of many Indic Islamic writings, you know, that I was talking about Amir Khusro, and he also has the story of the birds who, it's like a metalink who they quest, they don't know, they're quarreling, they don't know who the leader is, and in the end they find God.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful thing. They stumble upon God who is hidden. Yeah, beautiful, yeah. Beautiful. Go on, anyone else? Yes.
So I take the opportunity that I have the microphone. So, thank you very much for your lecture. I think I have a question, but I'm not sure I want to be clear, because I think I will think about your lecture in the next days. It will accompany me, but I have some ideas. So I really appreciate the fact, appreciate this dualism, which is not exactly a dualism between visible and not visible, that it seems to me it can be used against the dualism rational and irrational. So there is modern science, and what is not modern science is simply irrational. So poetry is irrational. What is contradictory is irrational. And that is the first idea that came to my mind. So it can really be used in this sense. And exactly because there is not this opposition between the two. It seems to me it's somehow a response to a personal need that I have in these days of war. So the quest for peace, it seems irrational, in fact. That is against the rationality of the international balance. How is it possible to say we don't send arms to Ukrainian or, I don't know, somewhere else, in every place where there is war? And if I say I would simply want peace, it only seems irrational because it's against the logic to say that. And so it's only an impression that is somehow invisible, maybe. But somehow the pacifist movement, how do you locate this in this? It's not a dialectic because there is no synthesis in the end. But in this situation, so it's not invisible against the visibility of war, but where do you locate it in this panorama you showed us? Maybe I'm not clear, but it seems to me it gives us some instrument at least to understand better what is peace and the quest for peace nowadays.
Oh, no, those are it's a rich reflections, you know, and helpful to me as well. And I think there are two questions here. One is really, you see, invisible, visible is a metaphor. It's a poetic device. Yeah. In this talk, it's a poetic device. It's a method. It's a method, to go back to what you were saying, and that you clarified for me so beautifully in your comments. It's a metaphor for how a certain tradition of nonviolence that is reflected also in modern pacifism just refuses antagonism. It's greedy. It wants both. That's all. That's all. But to do that properly, again, this is that very powerful point you made. I'm very grateful to you, that nonviolence has to also live with violence. You know, you can't, it is not the privation of violence. It is not the absence of violence. It is something that you find at scenes of violence. You know, some of the most beautiful things I have found are prayers from these sacrificial texts. There's one called the Shatapatha Brahmana. It's a really weird text. And you have in it, and also in another text called the Atharva Veda, description of the horse sacrifice, you know, because the horse was sacrificed because the horse was precious, the most precious thing. There are so many names, you know, for the horse in Sanskrit. And you sacrifice the horse. And the priest who is doing the sacrifice has a prayer, which is often used as a model for nonviolence. And it is, may I not hurt you. May I not hurt your beautiful head. May I not hurt your mane. Now, it is there at the scene of violence. Does that disqualify it? Not really. It's an aspiration. That's all that nonviolence is. It is an aspiration. But an aspiration that can't demonize violence. I've always believed that. You know, you have to live with it. You have to live with it and inhabit it and turn it around. Make it visible and invisible. So visible and invisible is the metaphor that works for me, because it's so strange an idea. You can only approach it through oxymoron or through literary device of obliqueness. And so it's a poetic rendition of just this idea that you have to inhabit the contradiction. And speaking of duality, one way that doesn't belong to this inquiry, but one way of inhabiting the contradiction is there are other thinkers from this shared ancient past who believe that the most wonderful number is 2. No, I love that, the mysticism of 2, especially in monotheisms. But 2 is very complex, 2 means coming second. It means there are 2. To be alive is to be in 2. Now, those 2 are not contradictory. There are 2, but the aim of life is to establish sameness between them. And this is very difficult for us after postmodernism. Now, I have started my quarrel with you, my dialogue with you, rather. After postmodernism, we think that the sign of goodness, of virtue, is difference and otherness. But, there are other traditions where establishing similarity, establishing sameness, is also very important between 2. There are 2, but they are the same. It's like saying there's hell, but it's empty. So it's just that nonviolence is it's also about not making an enemy of violence, of trying to say, it's not dissimilar. It's not dissimilar, but it can be like this, in this light. And these are all thoughts that you have touched upon, by asking, what is pacifism? What does it mean to inhabit contradiction? What is the question of duality? How does the question of duality serve? Those are all important signposts, important stepping stones.
Because I understand more or less how I can inhabit this contradiction.
Yes.
Personally, but as a movement, as a group, politically, institutionally, I have some problem imagining.
I'll give you an example. I found when I was writing my book, The Common Cause, there's in the annals of the civil rights movement, when you were training to be really badly hurt, as a Black activist, what you had to do is these training exercises where you had to become the antagonist. And these were pacifists. They wanted nonviolent. This is the nonviolent wing of the civil rights struggle, and there's a very powerful violent wing. And they had to impersonate and identify and play all roles, not just in order to prepare for the encounter. It was strategic as well, because you had to practice, but to understand with compassion what it meant to want to injure someone like you. And it's a kind of devastating exercise, but that's